First of all, thanks for joining us today. We're also webcasting, so hopefully all of you folks that are on the web can see and hear us okay. We're going to have a few people present here from the AER. First and foremost is Carol Crowfoot. She's our Vice President, Regulatory Operations and Economics. Also with us is Gerald Palenka, the Operations Branch, Technical Advisor. And then from the Office of Public Affairs, myself, Bob Curran, I'm the Director. We also have Kaylin Gray, Tracy Moore, just outside the door, Darren Barter, and also we have Jordan Fitzgerald, who's here in Calgary, and Carrie Rosa in Edmonton. We're going to have Carol make a presentation to all of you. I'd ask you to hold your questions till afterward, and then we will have a Q&A session. And Carol will be available if you want to speak to her afterward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Carol Crowfoot.
Thanks very much, Bob. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming today. So we're here today to talk about the AER's response to the report of recommendations on odors and emissions in the Peace River area. I have a presentation, but before I begin, I would like to provide a brief summary of the AER responses to the recommendations. As you've probably read in your briefing notes, the AER accepts the recommendations contained within the report. Details of the AER implementation strategies as well as timelines are included in the AER response letter that you have. The AER is taking immediate action on the recommendations, and there are a number of recommendations that we are implementing either immediately or very, very quickly. Other recommendations are more complex, or they may require the finishing of some scientific studies or perhaps studies from operators. So therefore, the time required to implement will be a little bit longer. And the other category of recommendations do fall outside of the AER's jurisdiction. So with that, let's get started. I can't see the screen, so I'm going to have to. Before I get into the technical briefing on the responses from the AER, I just thought a quick reminder of what this is all about would be worthwhile. So in July 2013, AER CEO Jim Ellis called for a proceeding and established a panel of hearing commissioners to conduct an inquiry into the concerns from area residents on odors and emissions in the Peace River area from heavy oil operations. So to explain a little bit now about the governance structure at the AER, I think it's really important to note that we're split between corporate governance and day-to-day operations and the adjudicative functions. The adjudicative functions operate independently from the corporate governance and daily operations of the AER. So in this particular proceeding, the hearing commissioner and the panel of commissioners that were on the proceeding function independently from the day-to-day operations of the AER. So the panel gathered together and decided to conduct the proceeding in 4 distinct phases, with the first 3 as background information, and written comments and responses from participants were collected at that time. Phase 4 involved the actual public proceeding, and that started on January 21st and concluded on January 31st, 2014. The panel's report and recommendations were provided to the AER CEO as well as to all public on March 31st, 2014. So as I mentioned, the AER has accepted the recommendations in the report that are within the AER's jurisdiction. In some cases, the recommendations address policy, legislative issues, or involve third parties, and thus fall outside of the AR's regulatory mandate and jurisdiction. The AR, however, has shared these recommendations with the appropriate agencies, and the AR has committed to work with these agencies to provide support and assistance. So let's get into the recommendations that the AR is actioning immediately. Number one, the AR will require new heavy oil and bitumen operations in the Peace River area to capture all produced gas effective May 15th, 2014. Secondly, the AR will require existing heavy oil and bitumen operations in the Three Creeks and Reno area to capture all produced gas effective August 15th, 2014. The AR is also releasing today the revised Directive 60, the Upstream Petroleum Industry Flaring, Incinerating and Venting Directive. This directive strengthens regulations related to flaring, venting, and incineration, and also increases opportunities for gas conservation in Alberta. The directive also includes new regulatory enforcement tools in these areas. The AR will require all existing operators in the Seal Lake and Walrus area to submit a report to the AR by June 15th, 2014, outlining targeted actions to achieve a phased reduction and eventual elimination of venting in these two areas. And the AR will review regulatory approaches to require operators in that Peace River area to collect and submit geochemical analysis of heavy oil from the Gordondale-sourced bitumen. As I mentioned, those are in the first category that we've either actioned immediately or we will be implementing very, very shortly. The remaining recommendations within the AR's jurisdiction will take a little bit longer, and we are currently developing a strategy to examine each one of those. For instance, we are starting to look at increasing gas conservation in the Peace River area. We will also be looking at ways to effectively reduce upset and emergency flaring. We will be looking at regulatory interventions to reduce and eliminate fugitive emissions, as well as emissions from truck loading and unloading in the Peace River area. From scientific studies that were mentioned in the report, we will look at additional sources of emissions and odors, and if appropriate, we will enact operational changes within the Peace River area to reduce and eliminate. Also, we are initiating a project to look at play-based regulation within the Peace River area based on the particular risks of that production from the Gordondale-sourced bitumen. We are also collaborating with the relevant Government of Alberta ministries to establish and expand on a regional air quality monitoring program. Throughout all of this work, the AR commits to continued stakeholder engagement of stakeholders to find out how we are doing and how the regulations are doing, as well as providing progress reports and information on how we are doing on the implementation of these recommendations. The AR will ensure that the outcomes expressed in the report and that are within the AR's jurisdiction are met. Thank you. And now I look forward to taking any questions. Thank you. The question came as to what made the AR approve and accept all of the recommendations. The recommendations were based on a proceeding that was held where stakeholders that were impacted, as well as operators in the area, and gave them an opportunity to express their views on the situation, in particular risks of heavy oil and bitumen production from Peace River, from the Gordondale source bitumen. The AR has accepted the work and the participation of everyone in that proceeding, and believes that the recommendations are certainly valid and will go a long way and hopefully eliminate the odor emissions and emissions from that area.
Can you also elaborate on what are the enforcement or action that will be taken place if someone doesn't comply?
Great question. So as with all of our regulations, there is always a compliance and enforcement tools that go along with that. With all of these new regulations that the AR will be enacting as a response to these recommendations, there will be a focused surveillance program for the Peace River area that will ensure that there is compliance by operators in the area. If there is found to be non-compliance, enforcement actions will occur and could also result in shut-in of either a well or a facility. Yes?
In Recommendation 5, it talks about implementing timelines to conserve all gas at sites in the Peace River area, and you accept that. Is that the goal here, is that there will be no flaring or venting in the Peace River area? Is that what you're hoping to achieve here?
Right. So the proceeding, as we read it, looked at kind of three main areas, and it was around capturing gas and eliminating venting, right? So we want to capture the gas. The second thing, though, when you capture the gas, is that you will do something with that. You will flare it, incinerate it, or conserve it, or of course use it as fuel to run your operations. The intent of the AR, of course, is to ensure that we are conserving the natural gas in the area. Now, we will look at the reports that come in from the industry and look at the feasibility. This actual recommendation is very amenable to the play-based regulation. If you're familiar with the economics of putting in a gas pipeline, et cetera, it would probably make a lot more sense if the Peace River operators worked as a play and we were able then to incent gas conservation that would be much more economic as an entire play as opposed to individual operators doing it all themselves. So that would be the intent, but until we look at the feasibility and understand what that's going to look like, but definitely gas conservation is a goal.
And do you see flaring as an example of conservation?
No, I'm sorry. No. Flaring would be the intermediate step, but we would want to certainly get the gas lines in there so they could start to conserve the gas.
Do you have any idea on a timeline?
So the report from operators will come in October 31st, 2014, and we will ensure that occurs. After that, we'll have a project team and look at that. Hopefully it wouldn't take too much longer, but I'm uncomfortable until we actually look at that problem from all angles and make sure that our regulatory response is appropriate before setting a timeline on it.
How many operators are going to need to send you a report? How many operators?
Right. I think there's 5 operators. So I think there's 3 in the Seal Lake and Walrus area that will be submitting that report on looking at reduction and eventual elimination of all venting in the Seal Lake and Walrus. And then the other 2 are in Three Creeks and Reno as well. The operators in the area are Baytex, Shell, Penn West, Murphy. Oh, I guess, and yeah, that's right. So sorry, there are 4 because I believe Baytex has purchased the operations of Husky.
And regarding Shell, I think they already have a system to capture gases. So are they also touched by it?
Right. I'm not sure, can the webcast hear the question? So the question is Shell, the understanding was Shell already has a closed loop system, and would these regulations touch them? The regulations will touch everyone, all operations within the Peace River area that is producing heavy oil and bitumen from the Gordondale sourced bitumen. If the operators already are conforming to the regulations as they're put in place, then they're in compliance. If they are not, then they are in non-compliance and enforcement action will be taken.
So is Baytex the only one who's not going to be in compliance?
It's uncertain. In Seal Lake and Walrus, Penn West and Murphy did not participate in the proceeding, which is why I believe the panel had given them a little bit of extra time to submit a report to the AER so that we can understand what that will take to have them capture all gas in the Seal Lake and Walrus. So it's the other three, I believe.
So it's Penrith, Murphy, and Baytex.
Yes. But really, all operators in the play in the Peace River area will be subject to all regulatory instruments put in place. Mm-hmm.
This deals actually more with Directive 60, and I don't know if you can talk on that as well.
I will try to, but we have Gerald here, so up in the front here, so he might be able to answer.
Part of the question of Directive 60 was that you're now making it the ability to implement mandatory conservation of solution gases for specific areas and projects, which would probably apply to the Peace River country. But if you look at those venting studies in the past, up in the northeastern Alberta around Coal Lake on the conventional heavy, there's a fair amount of emissions or venting. Now, could those fall under Directive 60 because the economic thing still applies?
So,
or does it?
Gerald, do you want to answer that?
That's an excellent question. Directive 60 will allow the AER the ability to require conservation regardless of economics, but it will not be applied in the entire province, basically. It's going to be used to our discretion, and this regulatory tool is in place partially so that we can use it on a play basis. And so it will be applied to the play in Peace River area, but not necessarily in other areas of the province.
Do you want me to answer this?
Well, and this sort of tracks back to Peace River.
Yes.
Was that, you obviously wanted the venting to end, but associated with that was the odors and the effect on people. So that was sort of that was more of the driving force than the venting, than the actual conservation of gas, would you say?
The driving force was actually to give the AER regulatory tools for the whole concept of the social license to operate. We intend to use this tool where operations are occurring and affecting people. So in isolated areas, we may not use that conservation tool.
Does that mean that we can see other regions than Peace River being who had to compile to this new way of directive? Beside the Peace River, like you would imagine, like it's developing and you have more people living in some areas. So how are you going to?
Well, the AER has developed internal tools and processes to intake those concerns of the communities, and we will assess on a case-by-case basis whether or not that tool will be used. But it may be used in other areas of the province, to answer your question, yes.
We just have a couple of questions that have come in from folks on the webcast, or is Carol's going to answer those, and then Steve will go to you next.
Okay, thanks, Bob. The first question is, how long does Baytex have, and can it flare the emissions, or does it have to install vapor recovery and do something else with the gas? So that's a very good question. So as I said earlier, the recommendations from the panel talk about capturing gas, eliminating venting. So as I said, you have to do something then with that gas. There will be flaring that would occur, but will end as soon as we can get then the gas conservation plans in place. So we're obviously going to move very quickly on that, but we will wait for the report from the operators to determine what that's going to look like. So Baytex, I do understand from the preceding report that they are installing and looking at gas conservation as well as flaring. So there is a recommendation on reducing flaring in the case of an emergency upset from venting. So in the case of a situation where they have capturing gas but they don't have a flare, they will be shut in if they are not able to continue to capture that gas. And the second question is, will the local AER office be asking the company to respond to the complaints, or will they go out themselves? So as I understand it right now, the AER will go out and respond to complaints. This is no different than it has been in the past. They may also ask companies to go out, but with the Directive 60, there is a protocol for odor emissions that will be in place when D60 becomes effective, which is June 16th, 2014, and that protocol will also be in place so that this focused surveillance of the Peace River area will be enacted.
Carl, are there specific challenges with implementing plans for venting with heavy oil reservoirs as opposed to regular oil reservoirs? I see in some of Directive 60, there's a 6-month time frame to develop a plan and 6 months to implement it. Does it take longer when you're dealing with kind of these type of reservoirs to get a plan in place?
I don't think so, and the reason I say that is from the preceding. Shell has certainly been very successful in putting vapor recovery units on their tanks. So I'm afraid I can't answer the actual engineering answer to that, but we've seen it being used very successfully and very easily, and even Baytex has indicated that they're in the process of doing it. So I don't get a sense that there is a time constraint or a time issue.
Is venting from heavy oil production an issue across the province, or is it specific to the Peace River area?
That's a great question. It does appear to be particularly specific to the Peace River area, and it appears from the geochemistry of this Gordondale source bitumen that it's very high in sulfur and aromatics, so that it does create odors that we don't see in other heavy oil and bitumen operations throughout the province. Thank you. So this question is, given the effects of emissions, given that what the effects of the emissions have had on families, and I'm assuming that means certainly in the Peace River area, why give operators until August to comply? There's no question that we would like to have this addressed immediately. The reality is that there could be constraints on labor, on equipment, things like that. So that is why the panel has given 4 months for the Three Creeks and Reno operators to fully implement VRUs, vapor recovery units, to capture gas from venting. So again, that is, I believe, why they probably understood from the proceeding that just getting the units could be a little bit of time, getting the labor to put them on. However, we hope that this will be done effectively and as soon as possible. They have a maximum of 4 months. Hopefully it'll happen sooner. So what does focused surveillance mean? So I think I'll get Gerald to come up and talk a little bit about the odor emissions protocol, but certainly the compliance within the AR is risk-based. And so when there are particular areas that are causing concerns, the audit and surveillance programs are stepped up because of the higher risks in that area. So that's what the focused surveillance would mean, but I think maybe a little bit more explanation on the odor management protocol would be helpful.
So just to elaborate on Carol's point, we do intend to be on the ground in the Peace River area conducting hydrocarbon odor investigations. Okay, so that in itself is a focus type of inspection, and sites that we determine are emitting offensive odors, we will use our compliance tools and issue enforcement action where appropriate. So this will happen in those areas of concern, and so that is an example of a focused inspection.
Yeah, no kidding. Thanks, Gerald. And I have another question that came in, and it's a great segue from that. The question is, can you please elaborate on what the consequences are for non-compliance of capturing emissions? So certainly, if a company is not in compliance in the Peace River area, once these regulations are in place and they are producing Gordondale source bitumen, the non-compliance action, if they are venting during what we call constant state operations, would be enforcement action that could also result in a shutdown of the well until they stopped. Certainly one of the recommendations on that emergency upset, if you're venting and there's no conservation measures in place and you don't have a flare stack, you will be shut in immediately. So there will be no venting.
Any other questions from
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for your time.